Science Intercepted. John Tresh's ambitious and feisty 2007 ISIS article, Technological World Pictures, Cosmic Things and Cosmograms, offers a generous parody of Borgesian excess in its list of objects, images, and texts we might analyze historically as cosmograms, or representations of the universe. And I quote, "Think of Lucretius's epic, Tibetan mandalas, mosques, cathedrals' pictorial narratives of creation and salvation, Dogon rites, Hindu palaces, Newton's Principia, Solomon's temple in the New Atlantis, encyclopedias, maps, trees of knowledge of all kinds, university ground plans, information architectures and search engines, Joyce's Ulysses, Darwin's Origin, the Eames's Powers of 10, Philip K. Dick's How to Build a Universe That Won't Fall Apart 2 Days Later, the space between two steps in Buenos Aires that contains the secret and conjectured object whose name is common to all men, but which no man has looked upon, the unimaginable universe," end quote. It's as yet unclear how useful this category of cosmogram will actually prove to be to historians of science, but the sunspot debate of 1611 to 1613, as we like to call it, seems an obvious contender to add to this list. Here we have two rival cosmograms struggling for supremacy. A Galilean transmuted sun. I imagine we'll be seeing these kinds of images quite a lot today, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, this is how sunspots were first printed by Galileo. Single page, full page images. A Galilean transmuted sun, stained and pulsing, turning on its axis and powering the spinning universe, challenging Scheiner's, his adversary, Christoph Scheiner's, immaculate orb, the central figure of a dance of satellites, choreographed with unknowable complexity. At stake is not merely the nature of the sun or the constitution of the cosmos, but the nature of knowledge itself. Fine work has been done on the strategies deployed in the processes of producing these cosmograms, from analyses of observational techniques through to printing shop practices. Here, though, I'd like to suggest that we're not merely witnessing a battle of cosmologies at a representational level, but a more complex interaction between several information orders, and that by paying attention to the nature of an information order, we might gain further understanding of the knowledge it produces. I'd like to propose an overly schematic distinction of Galileo's and Scheiner's information orders, mainly so that I can let loose a third order in their midst. Galileo's order might best be characterized alongside that of his contemporaneous, more famous and less successful work on tides. In both cases, a relatively and intentionally limited data set is allowed to speak synecdochally for the whole. So a group of shifting sunspots is charted as it apparently moves across the solar face's central band, and this is taken as evidence of general solar rotation. Similarly, the Adriatic Sea's tidal patterns, especially in the Dialogo, but also in works dating from the same period as sunspots, these tidal patterns are considered to be representative of all tides and therefore provide good generalizable evidence to make arguments about the world. The philosophical problem of deduction is given a geopolitical solution in the case of tides and a geometrical solution in the case of sunspots. Galileo's solar observations, moreover, are generally carried out by him alone, even when they are shared with or shown to others. This is a socio-epistemology based on ideals of individual excellence and strong staff support. Clearly, as observations are turned into printed books, such isolationism gives way to engagement. The text of the Roman part of the printed sunspot book, the Historia, is not written by the mind of the isolated genius, but supplemented, rewritten, and censored in dialogues of various sorts with other protagonists, Marcus Welser, Federico Cesi, and various inquisitors, amongst others. Even academic solidarity or the claims of property and propriety demanded by patronage make no fundamental change to Galileo's ideal of knowledge production, though. He is the first among equals, the divinely chosen explorer of new worlds, or in his own memorable image from Il Saggiatore, the serene eagle soaring above incontinent Yahoo starlings. Christoph Scheiner, by contrast, not only presents his cosmogram pseudonymously. I'll explain this image in a moment. This isn't about sunspots, okay, don't be worried. Not only presents his cosmogram pseudonymously, both as a picture that may be evaluated independently of his identity and a shield behind which he may hide, he also observed together with fellow Jesuits. Historians may have been too eager to turn the Society of Jesus into the original and paradigmatic scientific network, and certainly the earliest sunspot observations do not fit the idealized standard historiographical model of globally distributed disciplined observers. But it is striking that Scheiner's very first description of sunspot observations is with a colleague, and that neither name is attached to it. So what we're looking at here is the Catholic horoscope, where you have Ignatius at the bottom, and these are the various, you can't read it at all, sorry. Each of these little semicircles is the name of a province where the Jesuits are operating, and the idea is that you put little needles into each of these, and as the sun passes by, all of these little gnomons spell out IHS. See the S there, the H there. The point of it is kind of the same as the idea of the sun never setting on the British Empire. The sun never sets on the global Jesuit network. So this is slightly later image, but it's become a kind of emblem of how we conceive of early Jesuit science. For Scheiner, the question of pseudonymity was one of pragmatics and perhaps also modesty. Disputed claims about the constitution of the cosmos should not be tied to the authority and prestige of the society. Early modern writers on authorship, such as Descartes' early biographer Adrien Baillet in his Auteur déguisé of 1690, offered expansive maps of the ethics of pseudonymity. Baillet, in his study, is quick to point out that we should not impose a single historical model on pseudonyms. Although some, he says, like Protestants trying to trick Catholics into heretical opinions, are inherently untrustworthy, others, such as Jesuit missionaries in Elizabethan England, were merely trying to avoid unjust prosecution while carrying out the work of God. Modesty, prudence, embarrassment, or just having a strange name are all perfectly good excuses for employing an early modern pseudonym. Some professions even required the adoption of new names, prostitutes and popes, for example. It's not often you get to put both of those in a single phrase. Vanity, impiety, and cunning may, however, also figure. How is the early modern reader supposed to evaluate such texts? Well, one reader who thought he knew how to read the pseudonym and established the correct relationship to the cosmogram it underwrote, or in this case, as he thought, undermined, was Galileo's Venetian friend, Gianfrancesco Sagredo. This is a portrait that I've identified as figuring Sagredo, which was actually sent as a present to Galileo and hung in his study as he wrote the Dialogo and the Discorsi after Sagredo had died in 1620. It's currently in the Ashmolean Museum and is now on display. It was in storage when I found it, but now they know what it is, you can go see it. Sagredo had devised his own cosmogram, not so much as an expression of belief, but as an intelligence test. Everyone failed it but him. To us it seems puerile, but for Sagredo it was a mathematical paradox with profound political implications. How, the puzzle went, do you divide the world so that at no point is a priest on its surface forced to celebrate Christmas while a contiguous confrere is celebrating Christmas Eve? Obviously you can't. An international date line, as we now think of it, is logically, if not at this point practically, necessary. Sagredo didn't think up the idea of the date line, but he did push it to its absurd limits, well before Umberto Eco turned the idea around for his novel The Island of the Day Before. Aspirations for universal Catholicism, Sagredo claimed, are not just politically dangerous, they are logically self-contradictory. The geographical proximity of two mutually exclusive Christian rites invalidates both of them. Therefore, he argued, global Jesuit missionary activity should be stopped. Divine order favored multiple states, not a monolith empire. Rome should leave Venice alone. Geometry was political. This is a map that Sagredo sent Galileo, a 1594 world map. And what I'm interested in here really isn't the content of the map, it's where the edge of the map lies. Sagredo realizing that at some point you had to cut a line into the world, and that this cut would tear apart aspirations for universal Catholicism. Sagredo sent this test via Welser to Apelles, the code name of Christoph Scheiner, although Sagredo didn't know that. And Apelles, as Galileo also did, failed the test. Failed to understand Sagredo's point, or rather his line. His reply to Apelles' wrong answer, sent both to Welser and to Galileo, shattered the superficial civility of the transalpine sunspot debate. I quote from Sagredo, "This simpleton Apelles wastes time, paper and ink in stating the obvious, maybe to show to idiots that he's the defender of truth. He oppresses common speech with his indivisible mathematical points and splits hairs with people who talk with real substance, and then disputes things which have already been demonstrated, and gets it all wrong, so sure of himself because of his unknown name, just like the authors of the Philoteo and the Squintinio. But it's pointless because we know all too well who's writing and where his affections and interests lie." End quote. Sagredo linked the falsity of Apelles' arguments with the falsity of his identity, and honed this general point into a more specific political charge. So when he talks about Philoteo, he's referring to Giovanni Philoteo da Asti, which was one of the many well-known pseudonyms for the Jesuit intellectual reformer and propagandist Antonio Posavino, who'd used the name to defend Pope Paul V's recent anti-Venetian interdict in 1606-7, one of the major political conflicts at the start of the 17th century. In some ways, the lead up to the 30 Years' War. The other text Sagredo used as, that was an image of Sagredo's rather small world, the Veneto, taken from Magini's Italia, map of Italy, and this one is actually paid for by Sagredo. So Sagredo kind of gets to possess the Veneto cartographically. The other text Sagredo used as an example was even more controversial, the recently published Squintinio, or Scrutiny of Venetian Liberty, which became an international cause célèbre. Using intimate knowledge of Venice's ancient history, it offered a scathing analysis and critique of the myth of Venetian liberty. A single copy of the anonymous Squintinio, as Massimo Bucciantini has shown, entered the Venetian state's information order via diplomatic routes, with Welser's name attached as a mark of provenance. This swiftly became read as proof of authorship. The socio-bibliographic puzzle over the Squintinio's authorship remains unsolved today. For the Venetians, though, Welser was considered its author. Sagredo's depiction of Apelles' arguments as false because they're pseudonymous, with its surprising parallels to anti-Venetian polemics, is a nice example of the period's ability to read attempts to investigate the secrets of nature alongside other attempts to investigate the secrets of politics. What we may anachronistically label political theory does not merely draw up the rules for designing Solomon's house or the Linnaean Academy. It provides a hermeneutics for at least some natural philosophical inquiry. By establishing a single lineage to the authors Apelles, Philoteo, and Velsa, to be characterized by their common pro-Jesuit and anti-Venetian sympathies, Sagredo neatly invalidates Apelles' arguments. The German sunspot contributions, he claims, are part of the ongoing post-interdict campaign to destroy Venetian liberty. This reconstruction of recent history as a debate between duplicitous, concealed Jesuits and ominous, honest Venetians would perhaps be more persuasive were Sagredo himself, along with many of his closest allies, not to have also employed and deployed forged identities themselves during the interdict polemics of 1606-7. Sagredo's famous self-description as an upright citizen in the Republic of Letters sits uneasily alongside his anti-Jesuit hoax of 1608, where he pretended to be an ailing Venetian dowager with a heavy purse in need of Jesuit spiritual guidance. This epistolary satire was not a purely private vendetta, but was celebrated publicly at a party for Sagredo in an ode by the leading Latinist poet Ottavio Menini. Copies were circulated to sympathetic readers such as Paolo Sarpi, Grolot de Lille in Paris, and the English ambassador to Venice, Sir Henry Wotton. Sagredo even sent Galileo a copy of the exchange a decade after it had happened to help him draw up a suitably rude protocol to respond to Jesuit texts on comets, producing ultimately Galileo's sharpest anti-Jesuit attack, the 1623 Saggiatore. To investigate seriously the information orders behind the slow disintegration of Galileo's relationship with the Jesuits, though, we have to delve deeper. The semi-permeable membranes between the various organs, official and unofficial, of the Venetian state facilitated limited information flows and even, as the historian Filippo de Vivo has shown us, intentional leaks. But they also relied upon a range of activities and identities for the productive handling of documents. Spies, informants, and double agents were used. Mail was intercepted, transcribed, and resealed. False information both deciphered and spread. The Venetian state was far from alone in engaging in such practices, though its culture of secrecy and active archiving do make it an excellent case study. The interdict crisis produced a massive increase in the quantity of scribally and print published material. At least 300 pamphlets and books were produced in a period of just 8 months. Of particular interest in this context is the espionage system constructed by Henry Wotton, the English ambassador. Excuse me. Wotton's espionage was not initially based on a general desire for the new category of news, or intelligence as contemporaries called it, but was motivated by the specific target of the Society of Jesus during the Venetian interdict. Wotton sent to London copies of letters directed from Rome to the Jesuit Antonio Posavino in April 1606. His source for these interceptions was based in Rome itself, though he swiftly expanded his network of spies and informants to include people in Milan, Turin, Frankfurt, and even in Venice itself. Soon he became committed to, quote, furnish His Majesty with the knowledge of the secretist practices out of the very packets of the Jesuits themselves, end quotes, regularly opening, copying, and resealing Jesuit letters. Wotton sought to expose the hidden, what he called political instruments, istrumenti politici, of Jesuits manipulating the world. But his construction of a mirror system to expose Jesuit fraud gradually began to replicate its object. In November 1606, he sent James I an intercepted discourse by the Doge concerning Spain. And this was precisely the kind of machination he claimed to find so immoral among the Jesuits. Wotton's interceptions themselves became the subject of the letters that he intercepted, and this encouraged him. The trade of intercepting letters, as he called it, gained momentum as it became institutionalized and received a growing royal budget. During the same period, and probably not unrelatedly, because they were in close contact via Paolo Sarpi, Sagredo learnt to intercept newsletters, or avvisi, and prepared his polemical transvestite epistolary hoax, which ended with a promise to the Jesuits that they would receive his dowager's ducats only if they were able to provide authentic documentation from heaven that she'd arrived there safely. Upon Sagredo's arrival in Syria in the summer of 1608 for a 3-year stint as Venetian consul, Sagredo immediately transferred these skills, these local skills, into a global enterprise. Writing to Paolo Sarpi, he included details of what he perceived of as Jesuit machinations in India and Japan. Simultaneously, he continued his anti-Jesuit hoax by attempting to use the order's global distribution to his own advantage and convince far-flung missionaries to perform measurements of magnetic declination, possibly with an eye to solving the perplexing longitude problem. Natural philosophical and political intelligence traveled through the same systems. Such early modern information orders were not centrally controlled. Sagredo intercepted one letter in Aleppo from a Carmelite friar based in Isfahan to the general of that order in Rome, and another letter, more dangerously, sent from the Carimbas Islands off the East African coast from the Viceroy of India to the King of Spain. This was so risky and beyond his official brief as a consul that he was reprimanded by the Council of Ten in Venice and immediately told to destroy any copies of the correspondence that he may have made in his amateurish espionage. Sagredo transcribed documents in languages he could not read and resealed letters so that the bearer would be unaware that they'd been tampered with. Early moderns were more aware than we of the material culture of textual transmission. Such skills were not limited to Venetian patricians. Inquisitors also showed themselves to be especially astute detectives when inspecting books with false imprints. For example, identifying paper stock and typeface to expose the potential deceptions of print. So you actually find inquisitors getting hold of books at roadblocks going over the Alps and saying, you know, this book says that it's printed in Lyon by this printer, but actually we can feel from the paper that this is Italian paper, not French paper, and the typeface is clearly Venetian. So they're very, very astute critical bibliographers. Professional forgers even touted their prohibited skills to the Venetian government. In 1579, the convicted forger, Celio Malaspina, whose scandalous semi-fictional collection, the 200 Novelle, title page up here, from Harvard's copy, thank you Harvard, Malaspina's 200 Novelle, which would later be published and sold alongside the Siderius Nuncius, both of them printed by the excommunicate radical Roberto Meetti, sent the Republic a proposal that offers a privileged view of the power of documents in Renaissance court culture and the perceived possibilities for that power's subversion. Just want to show you, this is, those of you familiar with the Siderius Nuncius will recognize the printer's mark there, this figure of religion seated, a female religion with a papal tiara seated in Rome. So this book was printed the year before the Siderius Nuncius in 1609 with no printer's name attached to it. It just says Al Segno dell'Italia. But from an analysis of woodcuts contained in this book, I've established that it's actually printed on the same press as the Siderius Nuncius. Here's the Siderius Nuncius title page. Not by Tommaso Baglioni, as it says on the Siderius Nuncius, but by a political radical, Roberto Meetti. I put this up as a bit of a joke. This is the famous fake copy of the Siderius Nuncius that emerged in 2005 and was authenticated in a 2-volume study. with the lovely little inscription, I, Galileo did this. It has lovely hand-drawn pictures of the moon, which were supposed to be by Galileo himself. The whole thing from paper upwards is a modern forgery done by a guy called Massimo De Caro, who's now in jail, but not for forging this. He's in jail for having stolen 4,000 rare books from a library in Naples. So this is kind of weird evidence to put up here. This isn't the Sidereus Nuncius, but it's there just to show that Malaspina is in Galileo's orbit in Venice at the start of the 17th century. Malaspina started his career as a soldier, and he presented forgery as a branch of military strategy, no less useful than siege engines and ordnance. Forgery is presented in the petition to the Doge as an activity linking machines and machinations. It's a, quote, new invention that neatly fits into the structures of state building, he claims. The potential wonders of Venetian forgery and hacking, as we now think of it, are many. And I'll just give you a few samples of his long list of things that he says forgery can do and reasons why the Venetians should make him the official forger of documents. So he says things like, one may cast dissent and discord between princes, generals, colonels, captains, and other important dignitaries. One may disrupt the weddings or marriages of great princes and other important people, or profit from them. One may disrupt leagues and peace treaties and keep messengers everywhere to change letters and ciphers, make permits from any prince, safe conducts, letters of credit, passports, and other similar things. Leaving aside for now 1,000 other strategies one might respond to. So infinite are the actions of the world, which has already governed itself and continues to do so by means of writing, so that with any of these proposed here, you will always find a way to reap profit or inflict harm as needs be, end quote. The early modern world wasn't governed by writing, to use Malaspina's phrase, in any simple way. Controlling textual flows, duplications, or destructions was as much a form of power as dictating content. Which brings us back to Sagredo and sunspots. The series of observations, notes, sketches, drafts, letters, objections, revisions, fair copies, printings, engravings, as well as their physical movements, make up the exchange we now describe as the sunspot debate. It's a richly documented exchange, largely because of the geographical separation of its protagonists, Galileo and China, but also because of its mediation by Marcus Welser in Augsburg, its patronage from Cesi in Rome and other Linceans, and the uncommon attention to printing and publication by presses in both Augsburg and Rome. The debate progressed unevenly and out of sync with itself. Indeed, as Mario Biagioli, Eileen Reeves, and Albert Van Helden have shown, it was only really given the appearance of a normal debate by its print production, and might be better read in other chronological orderings than the simple dates of each piece's composition. The non-debate ran not only at the usual snail speed of early modern postal routes, but also encountered further delays. One of the sites through which many of these texts passed was Sagredo's Venice, where he, as Galileo's most loyal supporter after Galileo's unseemly departure from Padua University in 1610, and Sagredo's as the patient broker between Galileo and his former Venetian and Paduan friends, Sagredo detained, copied, and finally passed these texts over the Alps. The delays Sagredo's textual handling caused materially affected the progression of Galileo's exchanges with China, both intentionally, it seems, to give Galileo more time to write up his next installment from what initially seemed to be a kind of pants-down start, and unintentionally, as when Sagredo mislaid documents while moving to new housing in St. Mark's Square. Sagredo was not a frictionless wheel in a well-oiled system. His own reservations over the political sympathies of Marcus Welser made him an actively reluctant correspondent, and he intentionally misaddressed Welser to challenge the supposed hierarchy between them, and seems to have entertained the idea of leading Welser into his anti-Jesuit firing range. Sagredo told Galileo that he'd introduced himself to Welser in June 1612 via Jesuit interlocutors. Galileo's own first contact with Welser was as a sponsor of a critique of the Siderius Nuncius. Such credentials positioned Welser solidly within the pro-Jesuit camp for Sagredo, whose multi-regional cosmogram favored just such harsh and essentialist political divisions. I put this up to think of the sunspot debate. This is the errata sheet from the sunspot debate. Not usually the kind of text that you put up, but I wanted to put that up just to as a kind of symbol of how mediated these texts are, how many different voices are included in the production of an early modern text. And that's the kind of classic picture of frictionless information exchange taken from Braudel Mediterranean with data based on a study by Pierre Sardella of information transfer, this idea of smooth waves of information emanating from Venice. And what I want to think about instead is the friction, the diversions, the blockages that are integral to this system. With Sagredo's politically motivated delays in mind, we can return to our initial scheme of clashing cosmograms and see how the points of contact that shaped each of them were in reality mediated by other visions and practices. Tresch offered the cosmogram as a tool with which to rethink technological history outside totalizing Enlightenment and Heideggerian schemas, with cosmograms as multiple, adaptive, and subjective systems claiming objective status. It should be no surprise that immediately following Galileo's most violent clash with Jesuit natural philosophers, a clash that largely revolved around vying notions of authorship and authority, Galileo would construct his own metacosmogram, the dialogue of the two chief world systems. And what emerges from this short study today, though, is a cosmogram that itself both contains others and mistranslates between them. For a cosmogram to describe everything, it must contain everything, including other cosmograms. Tresch's list might therefore require some rethinking, but he's surely right to end with a vision of Borgesian excess and paradox. Thank you very much. Can I repeat the question? That's the. I could forge a similar question. Is there something fundamentally different about the nature of philosophical knowledge and political knowledge which precludes forgery in the case of natural philosophy?
It doesn't preclude it, but it puts it in a different plane. It means that it answers to a different process than that in
That's a big, yeah, that's a big question. That's a kind of what is truth question. What is truth in science? One of the initial reactions to the Siderius Nuncius was that Galileo had forged his data, or that these were somehow hallucinations or objects that were produced by the instrument rather than genuine phenomenon out there. Which doesn't go to, so that it is possible to think of forgery as at least short-term forgery in the domain of natural philosophy. But that doesn't really answer your question. I mean, we generally stick with the model that truth will out, and that science is an especially good way of producing non-forgeable truth. I'm trying to think and failing to think of a good science forgery case that actually stands. I guess forgeries only become forgeries when they're detected. They're not forgeries at the moment of production, but only at a certain moment in their reception history. Otherwise, they're just true facts. So we might. I mean,
can I just put it one other way?
Yeah.
You have, as you started with cosmograms, you have on the ground, as it were, the greatest set of cosmograms that are inherited basically from the ancient world that have to do with the nature of the cosmos as described in the first chapters of Genesis. And those are floating out there, as it were, as, I mean, to call them forgeries perhaps is a little extreme, but they are fictions of some kind or other that are backed up by enormous social networks and processes. But I take it that one thing that's at stake here is ultimately that they're bumping up against alternative cosmograms.
Right.
And the epistemological, ultimately maybe ontological stakes are different. And the curious thing about forgery is that it's the meeting point of these two plates, as it were. But I take it that but maybe this is my naive optimism, that the fictional cosmograms do ultimately get displaced by the cosmograms that answer to a different form of reproduction.
It's a very long process. Some might say still ongoing. And I mean, to be fair to Tresh as well, this isn't just a story of kind of the progress of science. The reason that he proposes this model of the cosmogram is to get away from a kind of either a worldview, kind of generalizable mentality model, and to think more concretely about multiple cosmograms coexisting in the same space and time. What I'm trying to do is precisely look at moments where contemporaries can conceive of multiple cosmograms and compare them, and what that tells us about their own kind of status. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, or do I get off the hook that easily? Sure.
Any work going on Belser, as far as you know?
So the question is there any work going on Marcus Welser? The last I know is Eileen Reeves and Albert Van Helden's Chicago edition of On Sunspots, which has a good bibliography on Welser. I don't know if anyone who's currently, he needs to be studied. Welser's a really interesting figure because you have this very, very explicit political agenda and antiquarianism. He's a key player in publishing. In fact, he's one of the people who publishes the ancient Roman map, whose name I've forgotten, the Peutinger map, is it? Peutinger. And he also is integral in producing lives of scientists. He becomes, the work that needs to be done on him is that if you look at his correspondence, some of his correspondence in the Marciana, a lot of that was published in the 18th century. When it's published, all of the politics is stripped away from it. It becomes this erudite, scholarly, frictionless, apolitical republic of letters, which we have inherited as a kind of historiographical ideal. If you look at the actual letters, they're full of, the interesting stuff is when the published text stops praising another intellectual and exchanging gifts. And then they start talking about invasions and troop maneuvers and machinations and those kinds of things. So that somebody needs to kind of recontextualize and edit back in the politics into the Republic of Letters. Welser would be a great figure because so many different worlds collide in him.
I'd like to stall a bit so that I don't have to give a paper yet. No, I have a question though about the Welser thing. You showed that first big image from Apelles' 3 letters, and it doesn't have the latitude there. It seems to me that you know that, like, an early modern reader knows that Welser is, cozy with the Jesuits, and it says the latitude, and you know that the thing was published in August iceberg. So why wouldn't you just go and look at Jesuit houses, right? That are at that level and say, well, it's got to be Ingolstadt. I mean, why wouldn't? Because the reason I thought that was, I mean,
That's very
a nice
smart,
way to go at it. But I was thinking about your maps and stuff. But that Dutchman's brief discourse, the thing that's written by Snell, is so snide about, Apelles, wherever in the world you might be. You know at least one coordinate of his location.
Right.
And Velser's always, sort of connected with the Jesuit. I mean, maybe that part I got wrong, that this is only our retrospective reconstruction that, he's Jesuitical.
Right.
But why would not have...
So the scientific data itself positions the observer.
He doesn't give you, he just gives you one
Right.
place, but he does say more or less, and you assume that it's published nearby. I don't know, I just seem to me...
No, that would work. Weirdly, Galileo doesn't seem that bothered to work out, at least initially, who Apelles is. He doesn't seem to care that much. Sagredo's the one who realizes that he can be the Jesuit, and his information, he thinks that it's Aguilonius in Brussels or somewhere. So there you have this bizarre system where you have this anonymous or pseudonymous author. Sagredo wants to attack him. The only way he can contact him is to write to Velser and ask Velser to forward the letters. Sagredo thinks that he's writing to this guy Aguilonius, and so writes these really insulting letters, but actually the letters are going to someone else, but he still gets replies. So he's talking to the wrong, because he's talking to a pseudonym, he's actually talking to somebody other than the person that he thinks is the real author. So you have this bizarre system where the pseudonym kind of takes on a life of its own, and a complete miscommunication going on. But the end result is the same, because Apelles himself does answer the letters. It's just not the Apelles that Sagredo thought it was going to be. And then it comes out in print, and it's no big deal. It's only Sagredo who's the person saying, like, you can't tell the truth about the world if you won't tell the truth about yourself, having done exactly the same thing himself. So,
I just have one basic question. Do Shiner's sunspots observations match Galileo's? And did they take their observations around the same time? And if so, did Galileo incorporate some of that data?
He incorporates later data. For the early ones, I can't remember if there's an actual observation overlap where you can compare. I think there are a couple of days where...
No, what I always did was put Thomas Harriot, and correlate Harriet and Shiner, and then Harriet and Galileo to get a map. I mean, there are not that many days that they're doing the same.
Right. There's not much disagreement about what the stuff looks like. It's just what on earth it might be. In terms of using other people's data, the really interesting bit is, I assume we'll hear in Van Helden's paper later, the afterlife of the debate. Usually we say the debate ends in 1613 with the publication of these books. Galileo gets it right, Shiner gets it wrong, end of conversation. But this isn't the closure of the debate. Various other people around Europe continue to write sunspot books using Shiner's model, which is that these are little moons orbiting the sun, that they're not anything to do with the actual surface of the sun. And dedicating these moons to the French monarchs, the Holy Roman Empire, the Emperor. These things have a kind of afterlife through the 16 teens and 20s. And Shiner himself spends years and years doing more and more complex and sophisticated observations, culminating in the Rosa Ursina of 1626, 1630. And then Galileo just steals all of his results for the Dialogo and says, oh, I was looking at sunspots for the last 20 years. Not a shred of evidence of that's true. So there's an interesting kind of reuse of other people's observations. And then the irony here is that the sunspots disappear for the next 50 years. So Shiner's book is all that people have to observe. The cosmogram becomes the reality at that point. Thank you.
And you mean disappear? It's not just that it disappears from awareness. They don't see sunspots.
Right. No, there's the long cyclical. I think it's more or less a 70-year thing. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you could pursue for a moment the fraud case, not in Galileo's time, but in ours that you mentioned of Decaro and the fabrication of this work. And can you say a little bit about what's been happening with this case, since you have a kind of privileged position of actually being a participant in the arguments?
Okay, so I'll try and do a very quick version of it because it's about a 5-hour story, the full version, and it's not over yet. So in 2005, a copy of Galileo's Sidereus Nuncius came onto the market, which had never been seen before and had Galileo's signature on it. It had a library stamp. This library stamp is the library stamp of Galileo's sunspot patron, Chesi, the head of the Linnaean Academy. That's meant to be a little lynx there. And it has these hand-done drawings. Instead of engravings of the moon, it has these hand drawings. The art historian Horst Bredekamp authenticated the drawings as Galileo's, authenticated the signature, the library stamp was considered genuine. The book was bought by a rare book dealer in New York, company called Marty & Lan. And although it was never offered for sale, the value was supposed to be around $10 million, right? A very detailed study was done of this by Horst Bredekamp and an international team, including Paul Needham at Princeton, where they analyzed the paper, the inks, the binding, and they said everything was genuine. I then heard some rumors that various components of this were suspect, so the library stamp started appearing with alarming frequency on 17th century books at roughly this time. And I thought, well, let's have a good look at the library stamp. So I looked at that and compared it to library stamps that had been in institutional libraries for a really long time, and it was just a spot the difference thing. There are some mistakes in the library stamp. So I knew that the library stamp was forged. Then Owen Gingrich, in about 2005, had identified 3 forged copies of another Galileo book, the Galileo's Compasso, which is a very, very rare book, probably less than 20 copies in the world. And those forged Compasso books came from the same person who sold this book, which made me slightly anxious. I couldn't prove that it was a forgery at this point until I found a reference to another copy that had also appeared on the market in New York at Sotheby's in 2005, also from the same consigned by the same person, though anonymously. But you have to, it's all about getting beyond anonymity. And various bits of this copy, so Needham argued that this was a proof copy, so everything that was weird about this copy and anomalous about this copy could be explained by it being a proof copy. The copy that appeared in Sotheby's shared all of those characteristics, which meant that there couldn't be 2 proof copies that suddenly appear at the same time. And there are just really minor things, like there's a little dot here, which is in both copies, and it's not on any other copies. And something that no one had spotted before, there's an actual misprint. It says, instead of saying periodis, it says pepiodis. And then, so that was kind of weird. And the P and the I are actually touching, which is impossible to do with typeface. So that made me quite concerned. And then I saw that there was a little blotch on this letter P, And when you look at the actual copy, it's an indented, it's not just print, it's not just an ink blot on the surface of the page, it's actually indented into the page, meaning that the letter must have ruptured massively, I mean too massively. That wasn't on any other genuine copy, but they found that that little blotch on the letter P was in the 1964 facsimile edition that was published of the Siderius Nuncius. And if you compare the source text of that to the facsimile, you find that the source text actually has a minor paper discoloration in that point, a brown mark. When it was photographed in 1964, that became a black mark that should have been taken away by a photo retoucher, and it wasn't. So that mark was brought into existence in 1964, not in 1610. Therefore, this was a forgery. Subsequently, I found about 15 books in total now. We've got about 5 copies of the Siderius Nuncius, probably about 4 copies of the Operazioni del Compasso. We've also recently found forged copies of Kepler's discussion with the Siderius Nuncius, a forged copy of the Frankfurt 1610 edition of the Siderius Nuncius, copies of about 3 other Galileo texts as well that have all been forged. And they're done really well. The watermarks are forged in the paper on some of them. The bindings are generally genuine. The stitching is pretty good. And all of these things trace back to this guy, Massimo De Caro. Although recently, I think I can say this, there's an article coming out in about a month in the New Yorker by a journalist called Nicholas Schmidl. Schmidl's recently interviewed Massimo De Caro, and he's admitted to doing these forgeries. He said he couldn't believe that anyone would take this thing seriously. Like the idea that this actually got authenticated by one of the world's best art historians and one of the world's best rare book experts. I mean, maybe he's just being kind of arrogant after the fact. He's admitted to some of these forgeries, but he says there are other forgeries that he didn't do, which are circulating. So there seems to be, both in this specific case and more generally, I'm about to write a book arguing that we are facing a crisis as historians when we try to deal with sources that it's going to become incredibly hard to differentiate between really good forgeries. We're getting close to perfect forgeries, and a perfect forgery is genuine. So I don't know what the solution is apart from to insist on very high levels of provenance, although you can forge provenance of books as well. So it's Celio Malaspina was right, and the Venetians should have hired him. You know, maybe we should just embrace the postmodern joy of it all. But that's the current state of the investigation.
Thank you very much, Nick.